All right, so I wanted to go over some of the strategies that I use to pass the mechanical fundamentals of engineering exam. And so I went over this before, but if you look at the exam specifications for the mechanical exam, it gives you a breakdown, a range of number of questions you can expect for a given topic. And what I did was I just put this together in an Excel spreadsheet and basically color coded it. So I said on the low end for mathematics, you can expect between 6 and 9 questions. And I just did a simple formula to calculate what the total percent of what percent of the total test that would be. So it's going to be somewhere for mathematics. You'll have somewhere between, say, 5.5 to just over 8%. And then I color coded them to focus my efforts on what topics would have the most questions. And the two things I had up every time when I studied for this exam is the handbook that I went over in my last video and this spreadsheet. And obviously the handbook was just used to study the topics and become familiar with it because it's a resource you can use during the exam. And this was just used to keep me focused. So I first focused on the thermodynamics, and I knew that at the time that I took the test, it had been over a year since I had taken thermodynamics. So I knew that one was going to require quite a bit of review for me, and that was actually what I focused on the most throughout my studies. Then I went on to the blue ones, because those were the next greatest number of questions. And overall I felt pretty confident in heat transfer, fluid mechanics. I studied those very little. Mechanical design and analysis, I studied that a little more, even though I felt good with machine design. But I mentioned this in my other video, there was some weird stuff that we never got to, I guess, in machine design for my class. So there was some stuff with planetary gears, there was some stuff with press fits that I just never really practiced, or practiced very little during my studies. And then on the exam, luckily a lot of that stuff was sort of just plug it into the equation and go ahead and solve it. Dynamics and vibrations, like I mentioned before, there wasn't a whole lot of vibrations on my exam. There was quite a bit of dynamics though, and kinematics. So then lastly, I went on to the sort of orange colored ones here, because those are the next highest number of questions to be on the test. And eventually I felt pretty solid in the topics that were going to be most numerous in the test. And I didn't quite focus on the other stuff so much. Engineering econ, most of those, honestly, on the actual exam were really self-explanatory. As long as you know those tables with the AAP, and as long as you know how to use those, you're pretty good. There was some stuff on Excel for the computational tools, but the number of questions for these are, you just get a couple of them and then that's it. So I really wanted to, I felt like I could figure most of that stuff out, and I ended up being right. Most of that stuff was, pretty self-explanatory. The hard ones were the ones that had the greatest number of questions. And I think on my test, the actual, some of the questions that ended up being really outside of the box were mostly machine design and heat transfer questions. I remember there being just one Excel question that I think I ended up getting wrong that really drove me crazy as I was driving home. But I remember there being some kind of question about a NASA orb. It was a heat transfer problem that also really, I was like, man, I don't know if I ended up getting that one right. But anyways, I think if you, as long as you feel somewhat decent on the rest of the stuff, don't focus on those too much, because they aren't going to be the majority of the exam. Focus on the really, what I was calling heavy hitters, basically. That's where you really want to focus your efforts, because that's where the majority of the exam is going to be. and it's where a lot of the less self-explanatory questions will be. So as far as the actual test, you're going to get just under 3 minutes per question. So make sure you practice pacing yourself. Luckily, I had just gotten done taking the GRE for grad school, so I was used to pacing myself. And for the GRE, I think you get like 2 minutes per question, something like that. So wasn't that bad. Just practice pacing yourself and knowing when to move on. Don't allow yourself to get stuck on one question for 7 minutes or something. You are wasting your time. So just know when you hit that, 2.5, 3 minute mark, know what that feels like in your mind, because you're not going to be watching the clock that closely. So you have to know what that feels like. You have to know what 2.5 minutes feels like when you're taking a test. Once you've hit that point, you got to move on. You can't allow yourself to become stuck, because that means you're going to run out of time and you're going to miss something super easy down the line. Secondly, the test is split into 55 and 55 questions approximately. Mine didn't end up being exactly 55 and 55. It kind of threw me off. I wasn't really expecting that. And I remember thinking I wanted to make sure I had it, half the time for the first half of the exam and half the time for the second half. And I ended up, there were a few questions that I had flagged on the first half. I didn't feel great about it. And so I went ahead anyways and proceeded to the second half. And I ended up flying through the second half for the most part. I think I had like something like 20 or 30 minutes at the end to just go back and review my stuff. And then I was like, man, I wish I could have gone back to the first half. Once you're in that second half of the exam, you cannot go back to the first half. So just keep that in mind. Unfortunately, you're not going to know what's to come. So you're not going to know if the second half is going to be really hard or not. My second half, like I said, for whatever reason, I just kind of flew through it compared to the first half, and then I was unable to go back. So just keep that in mind. And I think that's about it for my tips. I'd say just get to know the other stuff, but really focus on the questions that are going to be the majority of the test. Learn to pace yourself, and definitely know how to use that handbook, how to search through it, and know where stuff is in that handbook, and just practice.